Good afternoon. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Lily. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. I'm so excited to have this opportunity to have time with you. I've had a wonderful day so far, talking to lots of different people about the exciting work that's going on, and so really thrilled to be part of this panel. I'm also thrilled my daughter is here, so I think this is the first time that she's seen me speak, so I'm a little bit nervous, but so thank you. So two questions really drive the talk that I want to give today, and I'm not sure exactly why you asked me to come and speak, but one reason perhaps was for the work that I do with regard to understanding how to increase equity in higher education opportunity and outcomes. That's been a primary focus of my work since the beginning. This is really my driving interest, is try to figure out how to level the playing field. How can we ensure that all people have opportunity for high quality education? In recent times, I've become increasingly interested in this other question, though. So what is the role of research in an era of fake news? And this is a question that certainly is playing out across fields now. So people, questions around the debates around climate change, the vaccine denials. So this is part of our current time where people are really questioning the value of research. We chose education because we care so deeply about these problems, right? And so figuring out how our work can matter in this current time, I think has been interesting for me to try to figure out and reflect on. There are also some other issues that are going on that are important for us to pay attention to, and this is an example of one, the politicization of research. And so Sandy Baum is at the Urban Institute now, a professor of economics, and she called out in her blog how the Department of Education had mischaracterized her research in proposals with regard to changing the gainful employment regulations. And so here she's talking about how this happened. This is actually part of the ARA Code of Ethics to respond to mischaracterizations of research. And so thinking about what our role is in the use of research, I think, is important to reflect on. And so like many academics, when we have questions that we're trying to figure out how to solve, I've tried to address this question about what is the role of research in policymaking by asking a research project on, creating a research project on this. And so I've taken the liberty of structuring this talk to present a project that is a relatively new way of asking questions and doing research for me. So I have a master's degree in public policy, and I like to think that I've chosen questions over the time of my career that are policy relevant, but I haven't conducted research per se on the use of research in policy making processes. And this is my first foray into this, and so I'm pleased to take the opportunity to share this with you, but I'd really welcome your questions and reactions to this work. Certainly many people are thinking about this issue, about how research is used in policymaking. We have folks here. Professor Kirst is doing an exemplar on how you connect research to policy, and other people in the room are working hard to make this happen. We also have a lot of attention from the perspective of researchers about how important it is for us to connect our work to policymakers. So if you read the ARA call for proposals, last year, there was attention to having researchers making their work accessible. Part of what I've tried to do in taking on this particular study is thinking about, well, what is the role of policymakers in this part of the puzzle? So of course, researchers have to be thinking about the relevance of our research, but how do policymakers actually respond to educational research? So this study that I'm going to share with you is forthcoming in ARJ, and I want to put a plug in for just a couple of aspects of this project. So we first presented, and I had the privilege of working with two then students, they've now graduated, on this project, Kata Oros and Daniel Kent. We presented this at a conference in November of 2016, and then we went through two long reviews of comments with AERJ. We got really, really good feedback. The process took a long time, but the feedback that we got made this better. Now, of course, the length of the time that the review process takes is one of the issues when we're trying to connect research to policy, but we can talk about that issue if you're interested after. So, many of us are doing research with the goal of influencing policy, and so really this study is trying to think about how can we connect and understand the ways in which research is being used by policymakers. And specifically, we're really trying to understand what's the role of academic research. So our goal was to try to explain how legislators are using the power of their position to construct the contributions of academic witnesses in congressional legislative hearings. So here we're particularly interested in understanding the extent to which academic researchers are positioned as independent experts or experts who are there to advance the priorities of the legislators. We're focused on congressional legislative hearings, and so this is a particular genre of discourse. And so as a genre of discourse, there's a specific purpose. So this is a small part of the policy-making process, right? Many things have to happen in order for policy to be made. But congressional legislative hearings are ostensibly one component of this. There's a specific purpose, and there are specific norms and conventions regarding all aspects of the communication. And so understanding how research is used is going to be influenced by those different norms and conventions. And so to try to understand the role of academic research within this venue, we use critical discourse analysis. So discourse analysis focuses not on isolated words, but really trying to understand how the conversations and the communicative events. Discourse analysis views language as a social practice, and so the social practice is happening within a specific context. And so you can't understand what the words mean without attention to the context in which they're happening, right? A critical approach views language as a tool that mediates relationships of power. And so that's really what we're trying to uncover, is how language is being used in this particular context and in terms of the power. And the congressional legislative hearings are a place where power is part of the social institution. So part of the task, if that's our framework, is understanding, well, how do we understand what power is, right? And there are a number of definitions that are out there. For this study, we draw on Hay's definition of power. And there are really two components. So Hay draws across other research that's been done and identifies indirect, or what he calls context shaping power, and then direct or conduct shaping power. So the indirect, the context shaping power is really when the actor, in this case the legislator, defines the context in which the actions occur, right? And so in a legislative hearing, legislators have the power to determine who gets invited in. So that's one aspect of the context. And they also set the rules, right? And there are a number of rules in which that determine the nature of the discourse. What things you're allowed to talk about and how that conversation develops. There's also conduct shaping power. And this is what Hay calls when one actor causes another actor to do something regardless of what the actor wants to do, right? And so think about the ways in which conversations happen. So a person in a position of power, the legislator, can ask a question and phrase a question in a particular way that requires a particular type of response. And so part of this is trying to unpack what's the nature of these different mechanisms that are being used to elicit different types of information. And then that information then feeds into the policy-making process, right? And so in terms of just the broader context, right, it's important too to think about the motivation of legislators, right? So legislators are there at a congressional hearing, and more generally, legislators are trying to figure out how to advance their own priorities, right? So congressional legislative hearings could be a place where they're gathering information that advances a particular perspective or a particular point of view. So we focus on congressional legislative hearings, and we focus on those that were held to help inform the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. So I would argue that the Higher Education Act is the most important piece of federal legislation when it comes to higher education, right? So especially with regard to Title IV, which is the student financial aid programs. The Higher Education Act has been reauthorized 8 times since 1965, most recently in 2008. And so it's due, that reauthorization expired in 2013, so it's due to be reauthorized. And so we are positioning this really as, so these hearings are a place where legislators could be negotiating with each other to advance their particular priorities. Reauthorization is an opportunity to create new programs, to end new programs. You could create changes in existing programs. So it's a place where power could be operating. To identify hearings, we looked at every hearing that was held by the committees with oversight over the Higher Education Act from the day after the reauthorization in 2008 until April of 2016. Okay, so the context, this is 6 months before the election, right? So we haven't looked at anything in the current time, which we could perhaps talk more about how this might play out in different contexts. We found 605 hearings that were held. Then we reviewed the titles and we reviewed the opening statements of committee chairs. And we found that there were 191 focused on education, 80 that were focused on higher ed, and then 56 that we thought were specific to the Higher Education Act. And so we really focus on the exchanges that occurred between, in 19 of those hearings that involved academic witnesses. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier today to a few people in these conversations, this was a new methodological approach for me. And so it's been fun to continue to learn over the course of my career different types of methods and how to use the right analytic approaches to answer the questions you want to address. So I've learned that critical discourse analysis has many different methods and theories that are often used. So we tried to draw on the examples of a number of different folks. Our analytic approach is really grounded in Fairclough's 3-tiered framework, and this is consistent with what I suggested earlier. So you have the text itself, and then that is influenced by a discourse practice, and that is all shaped within a particular context. So the context is the hearing, the discourse practice is the exchange between a legislator and a witness, and the text itself is what is actually said, right? And so you have to pay attention to all 3 of those things in order to really make meaning of what's happening. And so we really focused on trying to understand that micro level of what's being said within the larger context. We also drew on something that's called discourse historical approach. And these folks were really helpful. And so they establish these 5 questions. And they focus, so why this approach resonated with us, according to, and I don't know how to pronounce their last names correctly, so these folks here are very helpful, I'm shown here. From their perspective, this approach seeks to uncover the discursive practices that mediate and reproduce beliefs. So they view power as an ideological struggle that's manifest over control of the social situation and regulation of access to specific spheres. And those things are certainly true in a congressional legislative hearings, right? The legislators are controlling access and they're controlling what happens here. They suggest that to analyze the discursive practices, they suggest 5 different questions. And so I took those 5 questions and I modified them to try to understand, well, what would be the analogous questions that would be appropriate in this particular context? And so these are the questions that we use to guide the analysis of these hearings. So as you can infer, this involves a lot of subjective judgment, right? You're reading the text, you're trying to make sense. So Kata and I read all the hearings separately. We tried to address these questions separately, and then we came together and we compared and we discussed and tried to come to some common understanding. So that was one way to help build validity. We also, for the article that's forthcoming, we included in an online appendix all of our data and how we characterized it, and so others could have a chance to look at it as well. Okay, so what we found, just in terms of the power to decide who is allowed to offer testimony here. So in the 56 hearings, there were 247 unique witness slots. But some people testified more than once in those hearings, right? So 219 unique witnesses, 26 people testified more than once. In those 56 hearings, 19 of the hearings had an academic witness. And so 9%, about 22 of the 247 witness slots went to academic researchers. 4 of those people testified more than once. So there were just 17 academic witnesses across these hearings. So this is a pretty small group of people who are being included in the conversation. Now, academic research is one type of research, but there's research that's being produced by others, right? So there are a number of think tanks and research associations, and so those are all, they're also included in these hearings, and there are other sources of research that are being included. But we're focusing specifically on these interactions with academics. Okay, so there are other aspects of the context that determine how and really shape the power of legislators in the discourse. So first, and perhaps some of you are more familiar with hearings now after having watched some hearings last week. There are a couple of things that are important in the context, right? And I don't know if this was true last week, but legislators know in advance what people are going to say. So part of what happens in this discourse is a couple of things. So to be selected, first, you're interviewed by the committee staff. And then the committee staff choose among those people who is actually going to testify. And then you have to, if you're going to testify, you have to submit in advance what it is you're going to say. And so the committee staff and the legislators know how to have their questions ready in advance. A second aspect of the context is the time limits. And so, and these are kept very strictly. So each witness is permitted up to 5 minutes to offer oral comments at the beginning, and then after that, each committee member in attendance has 5 minutes to ask questions. And so this is a place where they can use power, right? You can choose to use that 5 minutes to make your own statement, not ask any questions. You could choose to ask questions of everybody on the panel. You could choose to ignore some people, select some people. And so those are all ways that you could use your power of that position. And then third, the hearing itself is framed by the committee chair. So the committee chair gives the opening remarks and the closing remarks. The ranking member, so it's the committee chair, then the ranking member at the beginning, and then the ranking member and the committee chair at the end. And so those are both opportunities for folks to frame or reframe the nature of the takeaways and the key ideas. Okay, so that's the context in which these discussions happen. So I'm just going to share with you some of our results in terms of answering those 5 questions. So we start out first trying just to understand, how do legislators refer linguistically to the academic witness? And they refer to academic witnesses using language that reflects high levels of respect and appreciation for the credentials. So it's doctor, witness. The introduction refers to the research roles and accomplishments. People talk about other professional affiliations. The only thing that's a little bit different is that they also refer to state connections. So nice to see you from my home state, New Jersey, or whatever. Okay, the second strategy is how legislators use, how they characterize the qualifications of witnesses using other types of terms. And expert is a term that is used quite regularly. But it's used most commonly to refer to all witnesses together, so not differentiating the qualifications of the academics from others. And so as an academic, perhaps that's a little humbling, but each person, it's an acknowledgement that everybody who's there as a witness is an expert, okay? Now, legislators also use a variety of different strategies to solicit information. So across the hearings, legislators are commonly inviting responses from everyone. So as an example, a congressman will will say something and then say, who would like to address this, and open it up to the panel. So that would seem like a one strategy just to really learn what people have to say. Second strategy, on occasion, someone will ask a question that would seem designed to solicit information to explain something or improve understanding of a particular problem. So for example, Committee Chair Harkin articulated his view that financial aid is increasingly awarded based on merit-based criteria, but then asked the academic witness to explain what are the challenges to awarding more aid based on need. And so it's really a pretty open-ended question. More commonly, the academic witnesses are asked to confirm or elaborate on different aspects of testimony. So for example, a legislator requests that a witness disclose, quote, the theoretical underpinnings for analysis presented in the testimony, given the, quote, profound policy implication of the conclusion. So that's a pretty close read, right? Trying to unpack where is this coming from. Legislators also ask witnesses to respond to the testimony of other witnesses, so they encourage a dialogue among panelists. So for example, Committee Chair Harkin asks additional perspectives on an issue, asking any observations, thoughts on what this witness just said. Pretty common is to ask the witnesses for policy solutions, and I think this is an important takeaway for us who really want to do research that matters. So for example, Chairwoman Fox asked an academic witness a pretty specific question: what policy changes would you recommend in the upcoming reauthorization to make public-private partnerships easier and more effective? Like, that's a question we should be ready to, if someone asks you for a recommendation, that's a pretty nice invitation, right? There's also conversation where legislators are trying to understand pros and cons of policies. So for example, Committee Chair Klein asked for comments on an interest rate cap on income-based repayment options. And so, witness, you were very clear in what you thought about caps in light of the various repayment options, income-based repayment options, and so forth. You were pretty clear. I'd like to hear now from the rest of the witnesses, the other three of you, sort of quickly, the pros and cons of doing what that witness recommended. Okay, so those would seem to be strategies just to solicit information about a particular type of, pretty broad types of questions. The next two are more strategies that legislators are using to frame comments in particular and position witnesses in particular types of ways. So one is our strategies that frame comments of witnesses. So legislators use comments both to frame witnesses as independent experts and as experts who validate their own perspective. So one approach that positions academic witnesses as independent is to invite any comment from any witness. So, and this typically happened at the end of a hearing. So Senator Harkin frequently said in his closing remarks, before we close, I'd like to go down the panel for any last thoughts. As I've said, I wanted a general discussion. I think we had a good discussion. Is there anything else anybody wants to say? Right? And that would seem to be a comment that reflects an appreciation of the independent expertise. More commonly, though, legislators would frame queries within what's called claims of truth or rightness. And so this is really a strategy that positions academics as validating particular perspectives. So in a typical approach, a legislator would frame queries that reflect their own view and then ask for witness to a comment within the context of that framing. So for example, committee chair asks an academic witness to, quote, draw on the research you've done to provide an argument that supports his view that federal and state partnerships are more effective than what Senator Alexander said. Senator Alexander said, Medicaid is the reason why states are disinvesting. I want you to say why that's not true, essentially, right? So it's very clear the perspective of the legislator. There are also strategies that legislators use to amplify particular perspectives and then to mitigate different perspectives. So legislators amplify academic witnesses' roles as academics by requesting research-based insights. So in this, for a researcher, should give us hope too. There was definitely a conversation asking, what do we know from the research? So for example, one quote, I ask all of you if any of you know of any study showing the relation between the ever-increasing higher education cost and student debt. Right, that's a pretty clear respect of the research. More commonly, though, legislators are using perspectives that amplify their role as confirming the legislator's own priorities. So one strategy that happens is that legislators selectively repeat information that's consistent with their point of view, right? So in one example, a representative draws attention to a concern that she shares, saying, "Witness, I especially appreciated in your testimony where you raised some concern that I share about the problems of valuing a college based on the wages of an individual upon graduation." Another strategy that amplifies the role of witnesses as experts who are confirming priorities is using the allotted time to encourage witnesses to verbalize agreement with a particular conclusion. So here's just a quick example. Senator Bennett says, following up on what Senator Alexander was asking, given what you guys all say about the information that's required, do we even need a FAFSA? Do you think? I mean, could we get rid of it altogether? And interestingly, all three witnesses are women. But Ms. Conklin, absolutely. Senator Bennett, is that the view of everyone? Ms. Scott Clayton, yes. Ms. Cook, yes. Ms. Long, yes. And then Senator Bennett makes it really clear. Senator Alexander asked the question, but he didn't get an answer. So there's an answer. There's consensus. And I think it would be pretty worthy for this committee to just get rid of it, right? So there's really a selective pulling of information that way. There are also a few examples, and this would be the caution for academics who get involved in this kind of conversation, of legislators being very particular about questions and really serving to discount what the witness says. And so this is a pretty long exchange, but Senator Andrews basically walks the witness through questioning the source of data and getting to the end point saying, I just want to be clear that you don't know whether the data are right or not, and the witness conceding, yes, I don't really know, right? And so this is part of, if you give you a minute to read that. So on the one hand, the legislators clearly are prepared, right? They've looked pretty carefully at what's being presented, or their staff have, and they're coming with pretty critical questions. But you can infer that there's an agenda there, right? That this point of view doesn't agree with what I wanted to advance. Okay, so in conclusion, some of the conclusions we draw from this. Legislators are clearly using their power in lots of different ways. They're determining who to include, who not to include to speak. And they determine through these various practices what those contributions are going to be. Now it seems like from the information solicitation strategies I showed you before, explaining, elaborating, those sorts of things, those could be things that are used, strategies that respect you as the independent expert to give information here. But considered within this context of the power that is happening, it's more likely that even though they're framed as ways to solicit general information, they're really being designed to solicit particular information that advances a priority, right? Now, some would argue that there's a problem with this, but I think it's probably inevitable that there is this contextualization of perspectives, right? Given the interest of legislators, the whole purpose of these hearings is to advance particular priorities. So I think part of what's important for us is just to understand the context in which our contributions are being asked for. Now, Jeff Henning has a pretty, I think, an optimistic kind of view that perhaps would be helpful for anyone who's concerned about this type of framing of research. So he argues that if policies that are being advanced and enacted are consistent with the findings of rigorous theoretically grounded research, then our research has made a constructive difference and helped to advance the public good. But this is just the nature. For us, if we're doing work that we want to have used in policymaking, we need to understand this broader context. Okay, a couple conclusions for academics. So those who are called to testify have to be ready to be, and this I think applies more broadly, right? So when we have the chance to talk with policymakers, being ready with succinct statements, recognizing the power that people are going to ask questions with an agenda, being ready to respond for recommendations, and then being ready to defend any sort of research design related issues. Now, we didn't look we have other questions that we could examine, like who gets called and why, but it seems like to be included in a hearing, what's important is producing research that's relevant to the conversation. So almost all the academics who are included were talking about college affordability, but there are other federal policy issues that are important, right? Making the findings accessible, so the committee staff are really selecting who's testifying, but they're not reading our academic journals, and so thinking about those sources of information. And then sharing the findings with intermediary organizations, I think, is a way for us to think about connecting our research as well, as those folks are called very frequently to testify as well. Okay. So I want to transition a little bit. Does anybody have a question about that they want to ask just about that study? Yeah, Eric. Yeah, it's a great question. So I know a little bit anecdotally as someone who's been called, right? So I have an inkling about why, but I think it would be useful to unpack that more systematically, especially, so we focused on what's included. There are potentially important perspectives that are not included, and so how do you make sure that those not included voices that should be there are there, I think is really important. Anecdotally, my observation is that I was selected because somebody at an intermediate organization like AC or another organization in Washington got called, and they said they were asked by the committee staff, who do you know who can speak to this? And then they refer out. So really getting to know those people who are talking much more regularly to those policy people, I think, is important. And so that really leads, I think it's related to this second part, this final shorter part of my talk. So getting the chance to testify before Congress is a pretty rare event, right? Just 17 of the witnesses were academics. But there are other ways that we can and should be trying to think about how to connect our research. And that's really the goal of this book that I had published earlier this year, Taking It to the Streets. So I've spent a lot of, like many people in this room, we're really conducting research, trying to make a difference, and we're out there trying to connect the research. We're talking to people who are potentially users. But, I think in this current time, I don't know if it's a midlife crisis or just a worry about our current political situation. I really am curious about how other people are approaching this issue, right? Because it's good to produce high quality research, but we also want it to be used, right? And so the idea of this book is really to ask other people to reflect on how they understand this translation process. What are the things that they do? And you probably can't read it, but I have 16 nationally and internationally recognized scholars out there who are all engaged in or committed to trying to do this. And this is just a short collection. Each essay is pretty short, about 2,000 words, and really reflecting on why they do the work they do, how they think about making these connections. It was great fun for me to read their reflections. Taken as a whole, there are a couple of things I think that may be useful to think about. So first, there are multiple different ways to do this, and I think thinking about your own style on this, some people define themselves as advocates, some people define themselves as researchers. People are thinking about their identities. Even though everyone's out there trying to make connections in different ways, there are different ways to think about your own role in this. There are also some differences in the perspectives offered based on the different roles that people have at particular points in time. And one of the fortunate things is that, we need people from multiple different roles trying to make a difference on these big issues, right? We need academic researchers, we need people working in different organizations on the practice side. and we need just concerned citizens, right? So there are different types of approaches to on these issues. So there are a couple of questions that I just wanted to throw out there that may be helpful as you think about these things. So one of the themes for me in reading across the essay is this definition of advocacy. So some social psychologists define advocacy as, quote, an expression of support for or opposition to something. So an expression of support or opposition to something. Using this definition, all of us are advocates, right? We make decisions about what we're going to study and what we're not going to study. And by virtue of those decisions, we're prioritizing certain things over others, right? So because of the questions I'm asking around access to higher education, I've decided I think that's important, and that's a way of advocacy. So some social psychologists also define and distinguish between advocacy as proclamation and advocacy as persuasion. So advocacy as proclamation involves standing up for a particular view and value regardless of the data available, right? It's just, I believe this is so, and that's it. Advocacy as persuasion suggests a willingness to exchange different viewpoints, debate, defend, even change a conclusion in light of additional information, right? And so thinking about that, for me, that's been a helpful framework, right? Because there's some things that are important to stand up for, and stand up against, right? Violations of our core values, right? It's important to stand up against. But other ways in which we advocate are more in this genre of thinking about persuasion. And we have choices about when we're going to engage in different ways, right? We don't have, as academics, we don't ever have to say anything, right? But probably just doing the research and publishing it in the academic journals without trying to say anything more than that may get us tenure and promotion, but it may not make a big difference on these broader issues. So thinking about how we position ourselves in this, I think, is important. A second theme that people talk about across these essays is what is our relationship with relevant stakeholders? And this came out in some of the conversations earlier today, and there are clearly exciting things happening here with connections to the San Francisco School District and other types of partnerships that are in place. And those are really important, right? If we want to connect our research to policy and practice, we have to know what the important issues are, right? We have to work with people and raise questions and ask questions that are relevant and that people want to know. And figuring out how to ask questions that are really going to make a difference requires time, just talking with people and understanding the context and things like that. There are also important things in the book about reflecting on our positionality. We're not conducting research on folks, but we're engaging in partnership, right? So I think that's another type of theme. And just with regard to understanding how to build productive relationships, for those who are interested in this, there's an essay by Adam Gammaren in the book, and he talks a lot about what the William T. Grant Foundation is trying to do in this space, and that might be worth further consideration. Another theme is around how we communicate our results, and certainly, as we've talked about before, proactively translating results is really important. One of the things that's been really helpful for me in this space is collaborating with people who really are good at talking to policymakers. So, my collaboration with Joni Finney has been super helpful. We did a state review of public policy in 5 states, and I was really clear, I want a book out of this project, and Joni was really clear, I want policy briefs that we can take to the legislators. And so we have both the book, and we have also these 3-page statements for each state, and both they had different contributions, right? And so partnering with someone who knows how to communicate with this may be a strategy to consider. All right, before I go to my last slide on my last question, I just want to give a brief example of how I'm trying to think about these issues now. So one of my current projects is on free college, the College Promise programs. So I got into this, Martha Cantor, who is formerly Undersecretary under President Obama, is now the Executive Director of the College Promise campaign. And so she came to me a couple years ago and said, I'm advancing these efforts. I think these were really important. But I want a research base to this. I want to be able to recommend research-based strategies, right? And so my team and I think I know she's talked to other people about this as well. What my team and I did was to try to start, because the way my foundation is really almost always trying to start with, well, what are these programs, right? What is it that we're even talking about? And so we created this database where we're trying to keep track. And part of the, as you all know, when you create a database, part of that process is trying to figure out what are the important characteristics that we should be keeping track of. And so we have this database of programs, and it was really fun. You know, it got a lot of attention. Some people would call us and say, we're not in your database, we want to be in. Some people said, we're in your database, we don't want to be in. And so it's just raised all these questions about what these programs are. We've used that to do some academic writing. We have a paper in Educational Researcher, a typology that tries to, one of the questions I've had is, are these really new programs? Or is this just something we've been doing with a new name, right? And so it seems to me that there are 7 different categories of programs. I'm still not sure if they're different, and I think they're overlapping, right? So there's more work to be done. But one of the issues that, and I mentioned this to someone earlier today, but because our typology in our map, we have a map on my website, it's gotten picked up in a fair number of different news articles, in part because this is developing really fast. And in California, there are a lot of programs, right? There's a lot of activity. So people want to know what's happening. And so I've been asked to speak on these programs. And you know, my research about what we don't know yet, what works. You know, what are effective practices? And so thinking about how to be part of the contribution when you are still thinking about what the contribution, how to be part of the conversation when you're still thinking about what these things are, has been something I've just been reflecting on. So part of my approach on this has been to think about, well, what are the things we should be thinking about based on, because we do know a lot of things that are relevant, right? We know what matters to going to college. We know what matters to improving access and opportunity. We know what the barriers are. And so one of the things that I've been trying to think about as well, what could be the ways that these programs might be a difference? And then what would be some strategy, some design features? And what are some of the questions that we know could be some important unintended about, what are some questions about some unintended consequences and things we want to really be pushing others to think about as they're designing these programs, right? So it's a way to think about building on what we know to be part of this conversation and encourage people to ask the right questions and to collect the right data. So there are lots of ways, I think, with the work that we do that we can help to think about the connections between research and policy. Okay, so just on this last question, and then I would love any reactions and questions that you all have, is thinking about our roles and responsibilities. So, you know, I defended my dissertation 21 years ago. It was on the role of student financial aid and students' choice of college. And I certainly wouldn't have looked forward to what problems I'd be looking at 21 years later. But I don't think I would have imagined that the issues around student financial aid and the role that money plays in limiting college opportunity would be even more important now than it was then, right? In many ways, these problems around access and equity are bigger now than before. We have so many structural barriers to opportunity. And so I think with that in mind, it's really important for us to think about, well, how does our work matter? What is it that we're doing? And so there are lots of ways for us to make a difference. And so I would encourage us all to think about how and when we engage in advocacy, what perspectives we're advancing, how we're engaging with different stakeholders, how we learn more about what the problems are that need to be addressed, and how we're communicating our results. There are also ways that we can engage in different types of roles and responsibilities, well, in different types of roles. And one of those has to be, I think, in terms of remembering that advocacy is proclamation. There is a role for that, right? Speaking out when our core values are violated, right? And those core values could be around academic freedom or data and research. They could be around racism. You know, they're really some things that are core to who we are. And then thinking about how we speak out in terms of trying to be part of this dialogue, understanding that there are some really different views about the right policy changes that we should be making around some of these issues and whatnot. So how do we engage in constructive conversation to try to advance these goals that we have. So thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions or other comments or reflections on these topics.